you. Good evening, Chairman Merrithew, Your Worship, and members of the Finance Committee. Tonight, the entire finance package is pretty much dedicated to the long-term financial plan activities, and the first item on the agenda is the debt management policy that will comprises one of the suite of policies that we've included into our plan. So just quickly, I'll go through some of the context, and we'll get into the content of the policy. So you'll recall at our last meeting, we spent some time talking about principles and targets for our long-term financial plan. We talked about targets with respect to infrastructure deficit, reserve funding, pay-as-you-go, targets for tax rate reduction, and of course debt. Tonight we're introducing the debt management policy that will provide the governance framework around how the city will manage its debt over the long term in this plan. So why do we need a policy? This slide, we've seen this a few times. So the consolidated debt for the City of Saint John is approximately $240 million as of the audited balance as of the end of 2017. That would include all the city-controlled entities, so that would include the General Fund, Saint John Water, Saint John Transit, 17 different controlled entities for the City of Saint John. And with respect to the general fund, which is the, I guess before I say that, you'll see that it was $102 million back in 2006, and it escalated for several reasons to $240 million in 2017. A lot of large projects within that time frame that was undertaken by the city. With respect to taxpayer-funded debt, the general fund back in 2006 had a long-term debt of $54.7 million, and by the end of 2018, we're projecting audited, that balance will be approximately $106 million. So what are the reasons for a debt management policy as part of a long-term financial plan? So the policy establishes criteria for the issuance of debt so that we ensure that we have acceptable levels of debt going forward, and that we maintain those acceptable levels of debt. The second reason is I think it transmits a message to the public and those wishing to invest in Saint John that the city is committed to sound financial management, which includes making sure that we manage our long-term debt. And the third reason for this policy is it's simply a best practice. So we refer quite frequently to the GFOA and Government Finance Officer Association materials. Those are where best practices stem from for municipal governments, and one of the best practices for cities to have a debt management policy. I will highlight that this policy excludes Saint John Water, and it's for a number of reasons. We will be coming back with a separate debt policy for Saint John Water. But really the reasons why Saint John Water needs to have a separate policy is, first of all, the general fund is subject to different legislative covenants or debt limits within the Local Governments Act. That's completely different than the utility. Utility is very infrastructure heavy compared to the general fund and municipal government, so the debt covenants are very different, so we will have to reflect that separately. Saint John Water obviously has different challenges in terms of targets for debt and unique challenges with respect to differences between ratepayers and taxpayers, so that needs to be looked at carefully and on a separate basis. And Saint John Water, really, it's very infrastructure intense, and so with respect to that, the majority of costs are related to infrastructure in Saint John Water. And so we need to understand that very carefully and very differently than we do for the general fund. So we will be returning back as part of the utility component of the long-term financial plan with a debt management policy for the utility, or for Saint John Water. So the purpose of a debt management policy, we talked about the reasons, but what's the purpose? So the purpose is that we want to ensure that debt is issued prudently and cost-effectively in accordance with sound financial practices and policies. We also want to make sure that we only issue debt when it's absolutely necessary. And we've got to have rules and governance around what that definition is with respect to necessary. We'll get into that a little bit later on. We also need to make sure we now know, well, we all know that principal and interest in municipal operating budgets are expensed in that budget, and it comprises a percentage of your overall operating budget, and that can limit your flexibility. So we want to make sure our debt is managed such that the city's future financial flexibility is maintained in those budgets. Fourth reason is, the fourth purpose of a policy is that we want to make sure that we reiterate any covenants that are required from a provincial legislative perspective. In terms of number 5, there's really a strong link between part of this long-term financial plan will be also, this group will be recommending a long-term capital investment plan. And we need to understand what we want to finance in that capital plan, and so there's a very strong link between our capital plans and how we manage our debt. So it's essential that those two components are integrated. And last, we've heard this, and I think we've heard this from a number of levels of government. We want to distribute our debt and structure our debt such that the cost over time takes into consideration that intergenerational equity, so that the value and the benefit of the infrastructure that we're funding is being paid by those taxpayers that are receiving the same benefit. So that balance in terms of intergenerational equity is a key principle with respect to a debt management policy. So a couple things about a debt management policy, two very primary purposes. One, you want to set out what the acceptable conditions for using debt is, and the second, later on, you want to talk about what those limits are. So in terms of the acceptable conditions for the use of debt in this policy, the city will issue long-term debt solely for the purpose of financing the projects approved in the capital budget and the capital investment plan. So there's a complete link to what this council approves in terms of its capital budget and that long-term plan that we're creating. That's going to create the integration with our debt management policies. Second one, and I think this finance committee talked about this many times over the last few years, is we no longer want to use maneuvers, shortcuts to balance our operating budgets. And so this second one, long-term debt shall not be used to fund operating or maintenance cost or used as a tool to balance the operating budget. So that's strictly prohibited with respect to this with this policy. Third one, in terms of that intergenerational equity, we want to make sure that if we're using debt, that the long-term debt amortization period doesn't exceed the life of the asset that it's financing. So you don't want to borrow for 20 years on an asset that's going to last 5. So we need to make sure that we are cognizant of that when we're developing our debt plans. We also want to make sure that the debt policy, and that will be done through that integration with the capital investment plan, considers a number of things in terms of what you need to with maintaining a high-performance city. We want a balanced approach between maintaining affordable debt levels, maintaining our infrastructure and our infrastructure deficit, but also appropriate investments in growth for the community. So that it's really a strategic approach to managing our debt, integrating with our capital investment plans. And then finally, we also want to make sure that there's governance around the city being able to issue debt on behalf of some of our ABCs, pursuant to generally accepted accounting principles. So for instance, Saint John Transit, we often issue debentures on behalf of that entity. We want to continue to be able to do that with respect to our debt management policy. So the next one I'll go through very quickly because I think everybody's familiar with this. This is in the Local Governments Act, but we put it into the policy anyway. These are the steps that we take when we actually go through a debt issue. So first, we provide a notice to motion to council that we intend to borrow. After 30 days, council receives that, and then once the next report we bring is actually a report that asks for authorization to apply for that debt. So council will authorize staff to issue and sell to NB Finance Corp. Debentures at a range of terms. And then once we have that range of acceptable terms, we come back with a final report to council, and we communicate what terms we were able to actually achieve through the market and through the Municipal Finance Corporation. So that's something very common we do, but we want to integrate that into the policy. In terms of debt limits, and again, at the teeth of a debt management policy is those limits that you prescribe and ensuring they link with your strategic objectives of your plan. There's a few covenants or limits in legislation, the Local Governments Act, that we just abide by. The first one really isn't related to capital or long-term borrowing. The first one is meant to be a cap on if you actually had to borrow, which we haven't had to do this for a long period of time, but if you actually had to borrow to actually operate, so you needed general operating cash for some reason, the legislation has a limit that in any 1 year, a local government cannot borrow for its current operations any money in excess of the sum of 4% of the budget for that particular year. So if we were in a cash crunch and we weren't receiving revenues that were sufficient to cover our expenses, we could actually go ahead and borrow up to 4% of our budget, which is $6.4 million. Again, it's not really applicable to our capital investment planning, but it is a covenant in the legislation that we thought we'd include in the policy. The second and third one are really capital related. You know, it's pretty interesting when you see the limits. They're not very limiting when you see the amount of money that those limits are. So the second one is the local government shall not in any 1 year borrow for capital expenditures any money in excess of 2% of the assessed value of the property of the local government. So our assessed value in Saint John is about $6.9 billion. So 2% of that is $138 million. So this restriction is that we're not able to borrow any more than $138 million in 1 year. Our total debt in the general fund is 106. So I just wanted to highlight that restriction. The second restriction in the Local Governance Act is the total amount of money borrowed by a local government for capital expenditure shall not exceed 6% in total of the assessed value of the real property in local government. So not more than $138 million in 1 year, but in total debt, 6% would be $414 million in total. Again, we're well below that. We have 106. So those are the covenants that are in legislation. But really the meat and potatoes and teeth of this policy is those self-imposed covenants or limits that we're going to put in here to ensure we meet our debt management objectives. So we put some policy limits in here, and in the next few slides we'll go through why we picked these numbers. But we really leaned on best practices again on what are those key performance indicators that you should look at to manage your overall debt for a municipality. So the city's capacity to issue debt is directly related to our taxpayers' ability to service the payments, pay for the debt. So it's really an affordability linkage. And the three key performance indicators that we're benchmarking here is the first one is debt per capita. And this measure is the measurement of, I guess, how much per citizen the overall debt comprises. So think of it, there's 67,000 people that live in the city. You take your $106 million, you divide it by 67,000 people. Notionally, that's the allocated portion to each citizen of the debt of the city of Saint John. So we have a limit in this particular policy that the general fund debt per capita shall not exceed $1,600, and we'll show you in a slide why we picked that. The second ratio the key performance indicator we're looking at is the debt service ratio, and I think this is familiar to all of you. That's the percentage in your operating budget of principal and interest as it compares to your overall budget. So we've selected 12% for that one, and I'll get into why. And the third one is the debt outstanding as a percentage of the overall operating budget. So this is, if we were to hypothetically pay for all of our debt in 1 year's budget, what percentage of the budget would that require? So we have a $106 million long-term debt. We have an operating budget of about $160 million. So you just do the math, and that gives you the overall coverage. So we've put a cap on this right now that the general fund debt outstanding as a percentage of our operating budget shall not exceed 70%. And in the policy, it says that any additional debt that we take on here is only permissible when we are within these debt parameters, or when we are within these caps that we set out in this policy. So why did we pick these caps? Look at general fund per capita. If you look back at 2014, this is a positive trending key performance indicator. So back in 2014, every citizen notionally, their portion of the debt was $1,763. And by the end of 2018, based on our projected debt balance, we've been able to reduce that to $1,577 per citizen. So with our long-term financial plan, we want to keep within that $1,600 amount that we're in right now. We know we want this to go down continuously. We don't want it to go back up. We've placed a cap on here of $1,600 per capita. This can evolve and change as we go through down the road. This is a living document, this plan. But a couple other things I want to highlight. We talked about also the need to set targets. And if you recall the first slide, we talked about targeting of 25% reduction in our debt, or retiring 25% of our debt in the next 10 years. So our policy target that equates to that is by 2030 to have debt per capita at $1,175. So that's the target that we have, and so this particular one is positive trending. Second KPI is the debt service ratio. You'll see this has been quite consistent for a long period of time. 2014 floating around 9.34%, a little bit about 10.5% in 2018 and 19. We chose a higher cap, and we're targeting 9% by 2030. And we chose a higher cap for a particular reason. So if you think about this, this is the principal and interest as a percentage to the overall operating budget. But if the city wanted to get into a position where right now we borrow our debentures either over 15 years for the general fund or 20 years for the utility fund. Let's say we wanted to get a little bit more aggressive to retire our debt a bit faster. Well, if you shorten the amortization period, let's say, for instance, we chose to do 10 years for the general fund rather than 15, that would require a higher principal payment in your budget in order to achieve that. So just because your debt service ratio went up a little bit, that actually may be a better or more fiscally responsible action to do because you're servicing your debt. So we want to have some flexibility in the cap to allow us to make that decision down the road if we wanted to. So we chose 12% as a cap. Typically, if you look at best practices, they start getting worried when your debt service ratio is somewhere around 14–15%. So we're within those parameters, but we wanted some flexibility on this one. The last one, total debt as a percentage of the overall budget, or how much of the budget would require to fund to pay down our retire our entire debt. Back in 2014, our debt was about $120 million, I think $119 million. So that ratio was about 80%, approximately 80% of our budget to service the entire debt. In 2018, it's down to close to 68%. So it is a positive trending KPI. We've set the cap. Again, you can see we're at 68%. Why we set the cap right now at 70%. And our 10-year target, our policy target, is to have this ratio decline to 50% by 2030. So just a couple more slides. We also want to make sure that we're being very strategic in terms of our debt management. And we've included this in our reserve policy, and we also have it in the debt management policy, that if we get into a position, and it's part of our plan to actually start funding reserves, getting more flexible, having more cash available to mitigate risk and to fund capital. If you get into a position where you have sufficient amount of reserves and recognizing we want to get away from our heavy reliance on long-term debt, this policy would allow us to actually utilize reserve funds temporarily with commitments to repay the reserve fund to fund debt. So you could actually borrow from yourself through a restricted process, which council approved mechanisms to require you to repay or replenish that reserve. But if you had sufficient reserves, you'd be able to do that. You'd be able to forego the interest on debentures that you would otherwise be paying. So that flexibility financially is just something that, that's a potential opportunity for us when we get into a better financial situation. And have some, we were able to rely on our long-term cash management processes because of that. So we want to put that into the policy to give us that flexibility. And pay-as-you-go, again, strategic debt management, that's in layman's term basically using our current tax dollars to fund capital or to fund reserves rather than to borrow. It's justified on the grounds of keeping our debt burden down and preserving our future flexibility. And we talked about at our last meeting that this is really a core component of our debt management policy that will seek to continue to increase pay-as-you-go. And factors which favor using pay-as-you-go are, some cities that are in really good shape only issue debt for growth or for new capital, and they strive to fund renewal through their reserves and operating budgets. So pay-as-you-go, really, it's an aspirational goal, but it's using pay-as-you-go for your asset renewal and preserving debt for new and growth. Also, pay-as-you-go is for, it's a capital asset, but you don't want to borrow for it, so the useful life is less than 10 years, or it's lower than your typical long-term borrowing. So we would want to refer to pay-as-you-go. Also, situations where whether you're maxing or you're about to exceed your debt covenants, or it could adversely affect the city's financial health. You want to have that flexibility to use pay-as-you-go. Or also market conditions. So if you're in a market condition environment where interest rates have just spiked, to 9%, and you have that flexibility and you have that option to use cash, well, you probably want to try to avoid paying that type of interest rate with strategic debt management, and pay-as-you-go and reserve funding is a way to avoid those type of costs in those environments. So those are really, I guess, the preferred way of using pay-as-you-go. So the recommendation tonight for this policy is that the Finance Committee approve the draft debt management policy as presented tonight, and that the Finance Committee recommend that Common Council approve the draft debt management policy. With that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll just say sincerely thank you. This is close to my heart. I think I've said before, debt kills. I sincerely mean it. I've seen it kill corporations. I've seen it damage families, and a city this old without a debt management policy is, I think, is absurd. So thank you to you and your staff. Questions, please? Councilor Reardon?
With the internal financing, if we were to be flush at some point in time and we wanted to borrow from our own reserve funds, would this policy prohibit us from charging, from the reserve funds charging us interest?
No, we could actually allocate an interest to the, it'd be an internal charge, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kevin, if you can just quickly take us back to those graphs away at the start of the historical ones. Keep going. The line graphs.
Okay.
Yeah, so just want to make sure I understand. That includes everything, including clean, safe drinking water and harbor cleanup.
That's correct. Yes.
Which are basically the difference between that one and the next one.
Yeah, so if you look at the 240,
Yeah.
Over 100 million of that would be in Saint John Water for those two major projects.
So while that one looks like it's putting pressure on the overall debt, they are pre-planned.
That's right.
Long-term, once-in-a-generation projects. But this is the positive trend that shows that when this finance committee got together and started listening to you guys, that's the positive downward trend.
Absolutely. So you'll see, if you can look at the graph there, 2014, that's the start of the positive trend. So it peaked at $119 million, and it's just been, it's going down ever since, and 2018 to 106. So that's correct.
Yeah, and I just want to, because the other one, I was thinking when I saw it, and I thought, aren't we getting this under control? When I realized that last bit is online water systems.
Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Anyone else?
Thank you. Thanks again, Commissioner. A couple just to go through. I didn't have that bumper sticker debt kills, but thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of things. What I'm so excited about is that, and I'm just made a number of quick comments. One is, we need to have the long-term plans, but we also have to have realistic. So fundamentally, I would say, Commissioner, realistic long-term plans, targets, execution of those plans with sort of the right outcomes, and not overly unfounded assumptions. So in other words, just playing with top lines and playing with the assumptions, we're going to grow at 3% when we've, and again, so I think fundamentally, what this committee, continues to do, which is I'm so enthused about, is bring the policies forward, bring the long-term plans forward. So I really see these as best-in-class policies and an approach to manage the finances of the city strategically with a long-term view. And that'll pay dividends, and it will demonstrate what this council and hopefully the next council has in its major bucket of being fiscally responsible. Again, just kudos to this committee, but also our chairman and his leadership, the commissioner and staff. These policies, Mr. Chairman, and through to the Commissioner, success will require us, in my view, to be disciplined, to make smart decisions, and I put in parentheses, difficult and to remain focused, right? So, you know, and then hopefully with the policies cemented in place, so the suite of policies will be our guidepost. But what I've been thinking about over the last number of months is how do we cement these policies so that they've got rebar in them and they're in concrete, so that future councils run the baton down the track towards the long-term plans. And if I recall some of the conversations with the city of Fredericton, for example, and Mayor O'Brien, he would say that with great admiration of finance committees of 10, 15, 20 years ago, that they put long-term plans in place and they followed them. And it was hard, but they followed them. So I'm really thrilled that we're there. So thank you for that. Legislative limits, Kevin, Commissioner, are shocking. Could we put lower limits in place? That, like, you know, 6.4, 138 or $414 million? Could we put a lower limit in place than the legislative?
Well, that's precisely what we've done here tonight.
Oh, sorry, I missed it. Okay. Okay, so our covenants are much
right.
lower than the legislative.
That's right.
Okay, so we're out. Okay, thank you. And yeah, so I guess just in closing, I think this is policy 7 or 8 tonight, Mr. Chairman. That'll go along with the long-term financial plan. I think this committee is really setting future councils up for great success in managing the city's finances. So I'm really thrilled. Thank you to you and to the commissioner and all the staff. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I've got a motion. Someone move the
I'll
motion.
move the motion to
Thank you.
recommend.
Second. Thank you, Gary. All those in favor?
Aye.
And those opposed? All right, here. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
1.3, wage escalation policy. Mr. Fred, you're up again, please.
Yes, I am. Thank you. All right, wage escalation policy. So we'll start this presentation with some context, I guess, as to why we feel this is such a necessary policy amongst the suite of policies that the Finance Committee has already adopted, what the goal for having this policy is, a discussion on how this policy would be applied for the city, and our recommendations for adoption. So we've talked about wages and benefits and the fact that it does comprise the largest category of expense for the City of Saint John in terms of the percentage it takes of the overall operating budget. So you'll see wages and benefits in 2013 and it was approximately 55% of the overall budget, and it's been creeping up since 2018 to about 58% of the overall budget. And if you look at our trend over the next 10 years, and again, we've based our financial plan on realistic forecasting of economic tax-based assumptions and just the historical wage increases that we've seen at the city. So if you look at that projection, over the next 10 years, if this trend continues, 2/3 of the overall operating budget would be made up of wages and benefits. So as wages continue to escalate at 2.5 to 3% per year, somewhere around that, and of course, if this growth, this is based on if growth remains stagnant, this is a situation the city could end up with, and I don't think any business anywhere could be sustainable with a business model like that. So it is our biggest challenge is in addressing the structural deficit is the escalation of wages and benefits, and you'll see. We showed this slide at Open Session Council, Common Council. I want to show it again. So the change in the budget from 2014 to 2019, so 5 years ago, wages and benefits have increased in our budget by approximately $9 million, $8.9 million, higher than it was in 2014. Yet our property tax revenue has only gone up $6 million. So there's only one way to balance with that when that happens. It's to reduce cost, services, or increase tax rates. So it's clear that this trend is not affordable. We cannot continue to pay out more in salaries than the revenues that we bring in. And this is an interesting graph. I know it's kind of ugly to look at. But if you look at, this is a graph comparing the orange line is the assessment base. tax-based growth, and the other lines are the different employee groups. So if you just look at 2014, in 2014, wage increases ranged between 2.5% to 4%, depending on the group, while our tax-based growth was actually a negative 0.48%. Then you move on to 2015, and our wage increases ranged somewhere between 1 to 3.75%, depending on the group, and our tax-based growth was 0.56%. In 2016, 1.75% to 2.97% in wage increases, while our tax-based growth was 1.53%. 2017, it was 2% to 2.97% in wage increases, with a tax-based growth of 0.59%. And then in 2018, again, 2% to 2.97%, with tax-based growth of 0.39%. So finally, in 2019, you'll see it's the only year where there's one employee group that actually falls below the tax-based growth. So in 2019, wage increases ranged between 1.5% to 2.96%, where the tax-based growth was 1.86%. So we think that's a bit of an artificial growth because that represents over a 2-year period where there was a freeze. But of this entire period, only in 2019 does one group fall below the tax-based growth that we've achieved at the City of Saint John. So again, not a sustainable approach. So why is a wage escalation policy needed? So we're developing a long-term financial plan. The purpose of that plan is to put us on a sustainable path going forward. And to be sustainable, our expenditure growth has to align with our revenue growth. Wages and benefits have been escalating faster than our revenue growth. So this really is, the bottom line here is the ability to pay and affordability. So the wage escalation policy is needed to ensure that the city does have the ability to pay. And this ability to pay is considered when we're negotiating, future wage arrangements, as well as decisions related to other personnel cost. So the objective of the policy is to make sure the city spends within its means, to make sure that the wage escalation does not cause a tax rate increase or put risk to service levels, to make sure the wage escalation does not exceed our tax-based growth, and that the reason this is widely applied is that we attempt to make sure that all employee groups are treated equitably with respect to this policy. So how will we apply the policy? So the language in the policy states that the city manager shall recommend wage increases in accordance with the wage escalation policy. And the recommendation for wage increases shall be based on the previous 3-year rolling average of assessment-based growth. And we'll go through a calculation here to show you what that means over the last 3 years. So why do we want to use a rolling average? Well, we want to use a rolling average to make sure that we smooth out fluctuations in assessed value or different spikes in market for tax purposes. We also want to make sure we have a good sample size of history, because the historical trend can help predict future growth. It is an indicator of future growth. That the 3-year rolling average is actual evidence-based information. It's happened, it's transpired. So you can it's reliable, you can look to that. And a compensation model based on the 3-year rolling average, we want to be predictable, affordable, and equitable. So we also, not only do we want to make sure that we have a wage policy that's within our affordability, we also want to make sure that in periods of time where we have growth, or excessive growth, hopefully, that we're able to divert that growth to other either tax relief or to growth investments, and that there isn't a direct link with wages to the overall growth in tax base. So we've put also a cap on this, that wage increases, if we got phenomenal growth, still shall not exceed CPI plus 1%. And the 1% provides flexibility, also allows you to consider competitive market forces. But we also added in here, unless it's supported by a business case and approved by Common Council. So there may be opportunities where you would want to exceed CPI +1, but it needs to be proven through a business case, and that's got to have a positive overall financial result for the City of Saint John. So the rolling average, this might be difficult to see, but the table in your chart's different than this one because we presume there may be questions about whether 3-year rolling average is too short of a period versus 4 or 5. So you'll see in the 3-year example, if you look at our 3-year rolling average for tax-based growth, so in 2017 we had 0.59%, 0.39% in 18, and 1.86% in 19. And then when you do the 3-year rolling average for each 3 years previous to each of those years, the rolling average on a 3-year basis is 0.95%. So that would actually set on a 3-year rolling average, the limit or the limit on wage escalation if we were to use a 3-year rolling average. If we use a 4-year rolling average, if there's more comfort in using a longer period of time, it's 1.09% would be the rolling average. And if you use a 5-year rolling average, it's 0.99%. So it really depends on, we know the most recent information is usually the most relevant information. So there's pros and cons. So that's a pro, doing it on a shorter basis or 3 years. A con would be maybe you want to weight each year a little bit lower. So right now we're weighting each year on a 33% basis. If you went 4 years, it'd be on a 25% basis. So we'd offer that up to the Finance Committee. We have 3 years recommended, but we're open to change if there's strong feelings on how that's calculated. So again, this wage escalation policy really is an affordability policy, and we're recommending that the Finance Committee approve this draft wage escalation policy. We're recommending that the Finance Committee recommends that Common Council approve this wage escalation policy. And we're also recommending that Finance Committee provides a copy of the approved wage escalation policy once it's approved by Common Council, or if it's approved by Common Council, to the agency boards and commissions where the city is a majority funder, with the request for those ABCs to adopt the same policy. So think of some of those ABCs. You've got Harbor Station, Aquatic Center, you've got Police Commission, you've got a number of ABCs, Transit Commission that we're the majority funder. So we would simply be asking them to adopt, where we're so closely tied into their finances and being a significant funder of those organizations, that they would simply consider adoption of the same policy. And with that, if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Again, thank you, Commissioner Budge. It seems simplistic in its thought, right? If you don't have it, you can't spend it, you can't give it, and yet we've done it for years in a different manner. So I must give credit to Councillor Sullivan. The last little bit, I've heard him say this a number of times, so I'm glad to see a policy come up that mimics your thoughts. So you're up first, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, my thoughts are usually a month behind the commissioners. A couple of meetings ago, I mentioned ability to pay and matching revenues and expenses, and they said, "Yeah, we've got a wage policy coming." I said, "Oh, okay, never mind." And so, thank you to the staff for being ahead of it. If you can go back to the line graph again, please, Mr. Commissioner. Just important to note, even though that's a comparison of year to year, that's also cumulative, so that that gap between our revenue and expenses doesn't stay there. Every year that gap is actually multiplied by that gap as it goes on, to make it worse and worse. So that graph is actually worse than it looks. So you said it was ugly. The math in me says it's actually uglier than that. So it is certainly a key indicator of why it's so important that we do this. And the tenets we have in it, a couple of highlights I just mentioned that I really like. Ability to pay, and really that's what it comes down to. I think, I'm certainly in the public realm in my jobs, but in private industry, if your company succeeds, your employees should succeed. And really that's what this is built to do. We're in a tough time right now, but it's also built that once we get as we get our fiscal house in order and start to see that growth, this policy allows our employees to be part of that growth. And I think there's an good incentive there throughout the organization to succeed, so that we all succeed. To our provincial friends and counterparts, it continues to give responsible evidence behind the help that we need from them on ability to pay, to become part of discussions when it comes to arbitrations and all those kind of collective agreement legislative things. And I really appreciate that that's involved. And so I'm glad we have one more piece of evidence and formality that we can talk to our provincial friends about ability to pay. And finally, talking about the CPI plus 1% slide there, Kevin. Thanks. Supported by a business case and approved by Common Council. I know His Worship has alluded to, and I think, these policies we put in place need to survive us. Are we allowed to strengthen this in our policy that we could raise that bar from a simple majority to a 2/3 majority of Common Council in order to go outside of the policy? Are we allowed to do that?
I'd have to refer that question to the city solicitor.
So I guess I'll throw that out, and maybe something.
Who's not here tonight?
Yes,
so.
no, I understand that. Something to investigate, because I think we've got a very, very good policy here, and just knowing how politics works, I would like this to be, if we're going to go to an exception, I agree we need to have an exception in there, but if we're going to do it, I would love to see it be tougher than a simple majority. So I'll throw that out there for consideration. Thanks very much for the work. I certainly support this.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Reardon?
Thank you.
Folks, I think we're streaming, so maybe just use the mic.
Oh.
I think there's thousands of people at home.
Really?
Yes.
My mom.
Now there is, you're on.
Staff is watching.
Yeah.
Kevin, we read through this, you say that wages and benefits are at 58%. What should they be at on an average for other cities? Because the reason I ask is when I think of what a city provides and what everyone out there will say, if you ask what the city's providing, they'll say services. And services are people-driven. And I obviously, from being on the budget, know that there's a capital cost to all this, but that's what's in the minds of the public is services. So where should our wages and benefits be?
So our benchmark cities, somewhere between that we've seen in other cities is somewhere between 50 to 53%.
So we're not too far off, but we should be around 50%?
Yeah, well, one of the things that really inflates ours is we also have the temporary pension payments that are part of our payments, or wages and benefits, costs for the organization.
Right.
Where other cities wouldn't have a payment like that. So.
Right. So if we took that out, then we would probably be hitting around the average of what our budget should be.
It'd be somewhere in the range, maybe a little bit higher. But I guess the purpose of this policy isn't so much about benchmarking or comparing. It's about affordability. So every city is unique in terms of their ability to afford. And every city is unique in its growth and tax base growth. You recall we showed Moncton and Fredericton's tax base, and it's been growing at 3% plus, where you've seen the tax base tonight for the city of Saint John. So really, you can benchmark, but it's really, your policy should be unique based on the situation or your own circumstances for your city.
Yeah, well, and I guess in being the devil's advocate with this, not that I disagree with the policy or anything, but I don't want to see us get into a situation, I guess, where we're paying for services, et cetera, based on our ability, and we're not driving enough to make sure that we increase our ability. I don't want to become stagnant, with this, because, and I don't want to, on the other hand as well, we're in a community where we have 3 municipalities so close. That's also tricky for losing people as well, if we had. So I guess that, is something I struggle with this policy. And I, like I said, I'm not against it per se, but I just do have some concerns about it.
Well, you raise a good point, which is why we actually wanted, we didn't want it a catch-all. The reason we added, unless you can support it through a business case and approved by Common Council, those for all the other reasons. There may be a very good business reason. You may want to pay a little bit more in order to have an opportunity to achieve synergies in other areas for whatever reason through different approaches. So, that's still there for council to consider, but it should, like any decision, be backed by a business case, and that's in the policy. So I think we can still achieve the things that you're concerned about, but it needs to be solid and founded on a business case to do so. And
I'm not really concerned about locking it down or any of these policies, because I think these policies make sense, and I think that they will prove themselves, and so it'll be I would think in the future, hard to argue against these policies if they work, and they should work. So, so I'm not too worried about locking them down, because I think they do make good sense, and I think they're on us to try to get us on a sustainable path. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Roy?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Kevin, like, when we look at the objectives of the wage escalation policy, oh, thank you. The city spends within its means. Wage escalation policy does not cause a tax rate increase. Some of the things that it shouldn't do if a wage is awarded. I think this sort of aligns, and he may have answered it, but like, one of the things that jumps up is, you know, if a wage increase was awarded and it unreasonably harms a service level, should we be supporting that? Like, is there a way to tie within those 4 bullets that we consider service levels? So I don't know how you word that, and you mentioned the fact that the business case is already built into it. So if a business case cannot be made, then it'd probably be recommended that we don't do it. But is there a way to just black and white the language that, look, the objective of the wage escalation policy is bullet point, not reduce or harm current service levels at the time of negotiation?
Yeah, so this, I think we've I think we've put in the policy that, one of the objectives, I can't remember which slide it was, but we don't want wages to cause tax increases or service reductions.
Okay.
And what this policy does is really an accountability framework here.
All right.
Because you have a direct cause and effect. You know what your formula is. You know what your affordability limits are. You've got direction to the city manager to make sure you're within those limits. And if you exceed those limits for whatever reason, you have a direct cause and effect because there's a formula you're applying. And you'll be able to understand specifically why or what area is causing that to happen.
Okay.
To allow council to make accountability decisions with respect to that. So I think it's already built into the policy, but
Perfect.
if
No, that's fine. That's good. If it's already built in there, and I'm missing it somewhere, that's fine. I can go back. Like, when we're talking to legal about this policy, I'm completely supportive of the policy, and I'm not trying to say anything negative about it, but it's kind of like scent-free policies in the workplace. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden the guy shows up and he just bathed in Axe. Right? Like, you're not going to fire him. You're going to tell him, hey, we have a policy, don't wear Axe the next day, and the next day he comes and he has less Axe, but maybe he's still wearing Axe. Like, where does this policy get us in the face of binding arbitration and those things that when the employee groups receive this, our ability to pay for the folks around this horseshoe is one thing, but I would suspect that some folks in those employee groups see the city as having an immeasurable amount of ability to pay.
yeah.
Right? And that's the truth, because the reason why is because we have the ability to tax, which means we have the ability to pay.
So a couple things there. The policy states that we don't want wages to cause tax increases. Second thing is, you're right. I mean, we've got collective bargaining, collective agreements. And so this policy and collective bargaining are two separate things. But I think what this policy does, one, for collective bargaining, is it provides a mandate to the city manager, senior staff, in terms of what you're striving to collectively bargain. You're striving to bargain based on an affordable wage package and framework. You're also absolutely right on the importance of binding arbitration legislation changes, because that is something that is out of our control. And you can do a number of these things to try to put in place best practices and wage escalation and all kinds of policies. But if that legislation doesn't change and those arbitrated settlements result in much higher than required, higher than what we can afford in terms of increases, that potentially does pose a problem. But it does also give you, again, you've got a very clear accountability framework in terms of what specifically is driving that, and council has decisions to make with respect to those particular services.
Kevin, how many collective agreements do we have coming to full expiration in the next in the next year?
We have 3 collective agreements for the City of Saint John. We have the police, fire, and outside workers, Local 18. And then in terms of the agency boards and commissions, a big one would be Saint John Transit. The collective agreement for Saint John Transit employees is also expired 2019.
So transit, police, fire, and outside workers?
Correct.
And the only folks, if I go back to the previous policy, that have dipped below our, I guess our increase in revenue is management, correct? Is the timing of this policy in line with when those are, the fact that we'll be discussing those?
I think the timing is appropriate. We're going to be discussing those agreements very soon, and I think the timing is good to have a policy in place.
All right. All right, that's all the questions for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Mr. Mayor?
Okay, thank you. Can you just hit your
Yeah.
microphone? There we go, thank you. Thanks again, Kevin and all. Just a couple of, just to build on the themes, I think, of all of the other speakers. You know, a couple of things, I guess. One is how these policies all interconnect, Kevin. Targets, you know, I think we should, how they all interconnect, how they support each other. It's like, what was the game when we were kids, Red Rover? You know, and you had to run, if they're all interconnected and they're all supporting and propping each other up, they're not standalone, they're all meant to work together. And certainly the theme I'm on, building on my colleagues' comments, is, you know, really, and ultimately, you know, to Councillor Reardon's comments, we're trying to enhance and make Saint John an even more awesome place to live, work, and play. I think our services have been, by this committee's own data, call them under attack we've held the tax rate for 11 years, but with the data you're sharing us, we've been, you know, closing parks down and not reinvesting and, you know, and really squeezing the services that we provide. And that in my view isn't sustainable. I think I was just reflecting on, just in the last month or two, we've had a tremendous amount of support publicly for municipal reform. The Telegraph, many other news agencies have been writing day after day on municipal reform. And I'm convinced it's because A, we laid a case out for it. B, we got the other 8 cities involved in this, but we've also spoken very openly about the issues. One of the things that I'd like to see us, you know, do, and I'm going to, you know, get myself in trouble here, but I think we can't be selectively open and transparent. We have to be sharing the data, sharing the information, benchmarking, and not only benchmarking against our peers, but benchmarking against the private sector. It's, you know, it's my opinion. You can debate my data, but it's my opinion that part of our challenge is municipalities try to remain relevant and keep their tax rates low and grow and provide the right balance of services, is that, you know, in some categories our costs are 30 to 50% higher than the private sector. It's a fact. Our costs are 30 to 50% higher than the private sector. So, you know, I think we have to benchmark and we have to share. And again, I know people tell me all the time the private sector is not the public sector, but, you know, I would think certain positions would max out in their pay, that you know, what's that benchmarking? How are we benchmarking against not only, again, other municipalities, but also against the private sector? And typically, you know, certain sectors, for example, like IT and you know, some of the local companies, they've got a real talent recruitment problem. I don't believe we currently have a talent recruitment problem. If we're trying to hire a police officer tomorrow, we probably have 50 to 100 applications. I'm not sure how many people are leaving the employment of the City of Saint John. And on and on. So there's my point is, I guess, Commissioner, is there's a number of reasons why you look at what you want to be competitive, you want to attract people, you want to keep good talent. So my theme would really be around how these policies fit together, open and transparent, and not on page 23 of a web page, but open and transparent benchmarking and sharing of information, and loaded. And we did that in the fall of 17, I think, where we shared some of our loaded costs. And I think that's public information, and that should be shared. And then, ultimately, one of my dreams is that, I'm not sure if this is possible, but one of my dreams is that by 2030, the city of Saint John, just imagine this press conference, the city of Saint John wins as one of Canada's 50 best managed companies. Because we've strung all these policies together, we've reimagined our business, and so on. So just to pile on all of the other comments from me, I'd like to see us benchmarking, sharing the information publicly, and sharing that with our employees. And I'll end with, in a conversation with Don Mills, formerly of CRA, 40% of New Brunswickers got a raise last year, and if they got a raise, it was 1%. So the public sector is outstripping in many ways the private sector. So, okay, thank you very much. I'm very supportive of the policy, sorry, thank you.
Yeah, just last comments. I didn't want to leave without saying the same thing. Thank you to staff. Like the fact that we haven't had a policy like this. I guess council can take some ownership there. It's part of our responsibility to make sure that these policies are in place and go looking for best practice, and those destinations, and staff can take us in the right way to get to those destinations. The message is great, the timing is fantastic, and the mandate to the city manager is certainly very fair, and I believe in it. I think it's similar to a lot of our bylaws. We always great bylaws, but we lack enforcement or teeth to do it. And this policy for me is, although it's great in the suite of policies, we really need a provincial government that's going to allow us to have the teeth to enforce this. And the policy's bang on, but it lacks gripping power. And I'm looking forward to positive discussions and the end result of those collective bargaining sessions where they come out and everything's in compliance of that. But I can't help but be a little bit nervous of the fact that without enforcement or the ability to cause unions to be in compliance with this policy, that I'm unsure as to where the results are going to be on which side of the fence. So with that, thank you, Commissioner, for your leadership. You're doing a great job ever since you've been in the post. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Anyone else? You good? Sean, you good with this? All right. I'll close by just echoing what Councilor Norton said. We will need help.
We will need help, I think, from Big Brother in Fredericton, but, it starts with a policy, by the way, so, yeah. So there is a recommendation. Can I have someone move it for me, please? Thank you. And send it by Councilor Norton. All those in favor? And those opposed? Thank you kindly. Last item, public engagement.
Me again.
Okay, all right.
Sorry, you guys have to listen to me all night.
It's a pleasure, it's a pleasure. You want
I think I can get through this. Thank you. So, yes, thank you. So, we're talking about public engagement. So, for the first time in the city's history, we're developing the long-term financial plan. We've talked about how that plan is going to be supported by policies, strong fiscal governance, and we want it to extend beyond a single council term, and we're doing that very specifically in terms of how we design this plan. So the agenda, before we get into the public engagement part of this, we just want to talk about what we're trying to achieve of the long-term financial plan, then we'll jump into public engagement. So long-term financial plan, we're looking to achieve best practices in financial governance and policy. We're looking for long-term targets to reduce the city's infrastructure deficit. We're looking for long-term targets to reduce the city's long-term debt. We're also looking for strategies to eliminate our structural deficit. We're looking for long-term planning of our tax rates. We're looking for long-term capital investment planning. And also really important is financial monitoring. So part of this process is our financial health report cards that we'll be bringing back on an annual basis so that the Finance Committee and Council can monitor its progress and success with respect to the long-term financial plan. We also gave a snapshot about the timing of this plan. So we talked about Q1 starting some public engagement, and then having in the plan hopefully completed by Q3 with all our financial policies, and then in Q4 we'd bring the financial health report card to Council and the Finance Committee. So Budget Simulator. We're pretty excited about this product. So on March 25th, at the next meeting of Common Council, as part of a best practice for long-term financial planning, we'll be inviting the public to participate in providing feedback to the city through a budget simulator. The simulator will run between March 25th, so it'll launch at Council, an open session. We'll provide a more extensive presentation that night than we are tonight. It'll start March 25th and run to April 11th. So first and foremost, what will we be doing with this feedback? So the public's feedback by using this tool is one of many inputs that will be used in development of the financial plan. And what we're really looking for is themes. So themes in the overall responses that may shed light on how the public sees the city should prioritize our tax dollars, how the community values the services that the city provides. And these themes will be consolidated. They'll be looked at in terms of different demographic information, and we'll look to see whether we can glean any sort of themes that will help the Finance Committee, again, just as one of a lot of inputs that's going to go into developing this plan. We also see this as a tremendous opportunity to communicate with the public. We want to make sure by using this tool, and we'll talk about how the tool works in a little bit, that when you use a tool that the public's well informed on the choices that they're selecting in the simulator. So why is this a really good opportunity to communicate with the public? The simulator itself, there's lots of content, lots of links to documents and plans, but really what we're really excited about is there's a lot of videos in the simulator, and we're going to show one tonight just as an example later on, that really profile the good work in the city services that we have. And what I like about the videos is they talk about service levels in the videos, so you can get an understanding of what value for money for the tax dollar that the taxpayer is receiving. So it's a really good opportunity for us to communicate, but it's also a good opportunity to educate. And so what the public will find, and what many of us have found, is it's not an easy task to try to balance the operating budget. And so it's an opportunity to look at the realities of the city. We're using real information. So the challenge is for a 2021 to balance the budget for that particular year. So it really does provide a bit of an education. So are we the first to do this? No. Again, best practice, long-term financial planning. A lot of cities use these tools to actually do their budgeting as well, or long-term budgeting. So you'll see some of the cities that do this type of exercise. Budget allocators and budget simulators have been used in Halifax, Calgary, Ottawa, Edmonton, London, Brampton, so on and so forth. So, we really are following a process that's been used by many cities across Canada. So I mentioned the challenge in the simulator using real numbers. So within the tool, we're going to task the user to try to balance the city's projected 2021 budget shortfall. And the challenge in the tool is $9 million for 2021, and I'll explain why we selected that particular amount. So when we forecast our budget, our structural deficits, 2021 is the year that the short-term financial assistance from the province expires to the City of Saint John, and that's the year the city will be faced with some challenging decisions and choices. The actual deficit forecast in 2021 is $12 million for that year, but we've through a number of initiatives, austerity projects and efficiency projects, we're actually targeting to be able to address $3 million of that gap just by the work that we're doing now within the city. So we are asking for $9 million shortfall to be addressed in the tool. The program is very simple to use. So it's a slider-based program. So the user will be able to the resident can increase or decrease or maintain service levels that directly tie to the amount in the budget. And on the side of the slider tool, there'll be real numbers, there'll be real service impacts, real consequences, or real benefits, because one of the options are to increase services for some of these sliders. And there's lots of content for the public to be able to read through and watch videos and make as much of an informed decision as they can. So by using the budget simulator, you'll not only be able to provide direct feedback to the city on how you feel about our municipal services and how we should prioritize your spending, but you'll also be able to share your results. You can share your results on social media. We're going to have more information on our website, www.stjohn.ca. We'll be having Twitter and Facebook updates over the next week. You can tune into Common Council for the more extensive presentation where we'll actually do a full demo of the budget simulator. We have a communications plan how this will roll out, and we also have an email that we've set up, stjohnbudgetsimulator.com. In event there's questions from the public, and also Nancy Moore, our communications lead, is here tonight if there's questions on our communications plan. So in terms of our timeline and our next steps, so tonight we're sort of launching this. We really want to frame the expectations on this. It is just one input into this whole process. So we're excited for the education and the communication opportunity. We'll provide that presentation in open session that I referred to on March 25th. Simulator will open that night right after the meeting, and then it'll close on April 11th. And of course, we're targeting the end of the long-term financial plan to release the plan in Q3, and we'll have the results of the public simulator prior to that as well. So with that, I would like to show one short video, an example of one of the service videos that's in the simulator. And I think Hillary's at the sidewalk maintenance that we're going to show. Okay.
Sidewalks are a key part of St. John's transportation network. I'm Steve Edgar, and I'm a part of the crew that provides clean, accessible, and safe places for pedestrian traffic. There are 402 kilometers of sidewalks in the city of St. John. We focus on repairing or replacing sidewalk sections to eliminate trip hazards. We install access ramps to make sure sidewalks are accessible to everyone. We repair sidewalks using a priority system, depending on the hazard and how much pedestrian traffic there is in the area. In 2018, we completed 288 sidewalk repairs. We repaired 410 square meters of brick sidewalk, 440 meters of concrete curb, and 1,660 square meters of concrete sidewalk. Well-maintained, connected, and accessible sidewalks allow pedestrians to go to school, work, shop, run errands, access public transit and businesses, and exercise safely. Sidewalks are a critical piece of Move SJ, the city's transportation planning project. On behalf of our crews, thank you for finding out how we provide sidewalk service here in the city. For more information, click the links below.
So you'll see in the video we try to really focus on service levels and information and content about service levels, so that when you're using the budget simulator, you can see that that's the focus of the exercise. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions for the commissioner? Comments, concerns? Councilor Root.
I know you're just going to use this as one tool, and I guess considering the neighborhood that I live in, where 50% of kids are living in poverty, and I'm worried about the literacy rate, etc. And I'm terrible with this stuff anyway, so since we had it the last time, I'm hoping it's improved or I've improved. I'm just wondering if there's been any feedback on what you see for demographics coming back, that will actually take the time and can read with understanding and actually complete this. I'm wondering what the feedback is just from the company. I notice there's 3 companies though, hey? Is it 3 different ones that do it? There's Citizen Budget, Budget Allocator, and Budget Simulator?
Yeah, and we're using the budget simulator.
Yeah, I see that. I realize that. That looks like the least popular one on my thing here.
So thank you for asking that. Actually, we just were at Adelaide Street today demonstrating this with employees, and we've reached out to the community support folks, and they're going to be helping us go out into the community with this and to target specific community groups. So we'll be working with them.
So you'll just go to the groups, you won't be doing an open house or that sort of thing?
We
You'll just
will-
try to get out to the groups, or
We'll be doing both.
both? Okay,
Yeah.
excellent.
We do recognize that there's, some groups that might
I'm
need,
in that group,
right,
challenged when it
right.
comes to this stuff, so, okay, sounds good.
So you'll be helping with the index cards.
Exactly.
Oh, and also, we developed a paper-based tool for people who don't want to do any of this. So we'll make that available as well.
And just to add on that, in terms of the demographic information, we were asking a number of questions at the end of the simulator. Your age, the wards you're in. So we will be able to identify some specific areas and themes in terms of areas of concern and the feedback that we receive from those areas.
Any others?
Just a quick comment again. It's a great night of great initiatives. Yeah, I'm really excited about it. I'm glad to Councillor Reardon's question. I mean, I'm glad to hear. I'm not surprised that we're adapting to a paper version and all kinds of other ways to engage with folks. But this is one area that it sort of engage, educate, and hear from, and it's an area that is, in my view, not well understood, quite complex. The operations of a big city, we're a $200 million corporation. It's complex, so I'm really looking forward to the feedback. To having this as one tool as we roll into budget 2020, which will start likely this summer. So I'm glad to hear that we're going to do the online, that we got some paper version, that we'll find ways to reach out and engage with folks, but also quite excited to give people an opportunity to just play with the numbers, whether it's on cardstock or whether it's online, and to understand how complicated it is, and that if you're going to put a toonie in that bucket over there, the toonie's got to come from somewhere. And I think just like our households, that can be very difficult. So I'm really looking forward to the feedback to see what kind of participation we get. And I'm glad that the city has taken the step to use this as one of the inputs, into us formulating our budgets over the next years to come. So again, congratulations and thank you.
Councillor Norton?
Thank you. Similar to Councillor Reardon, one of the concerns was literacy, and this is a real opportunity to improve the municipal financial literacy of our landscape. Like, this is our chance. I remember going back, this was probably 5 or 6 years ago, and looking at citizen participatory budgeting tools, and talking about it way back then. I'm not saying that I was the one that brought this. Just talking about it back then with a number of other folks, and I think it was maybe Halifax or one of those places that had it back then. Like, this is, if we're gonna increase the knowledge and the competency and the inclusiveness of our community, I can't think of a better tool to do this. Like, we talk about folks maybe not understanding the complexities of our budget. There it is. Like, here's a great way to improve the knowledge of our citizenry regarding some of the issues that we have. So when we're trying to convey our problems about why growth is so important, or what our pain points are, why it's so important to get the type of support that we need from Big Brother in Fredericton, like, this is a great way. This budgeting tool is a really great way to be able to do it. And like most things, there's going to come a learning curve, but we're better at the end of that exercise than we were before we began it. So, great job. I know there's going to be strong communications plan behind it, and Nancy will do a fantastic job with that, getting out to those folks and helping them. And another great thing coming out of our Department of Finance. So, thank you.
Very well said, brother. City Manager?
If I may, one point that we have not emphasized here this evening that I think is worthwhile, and it rides on Councillor Norton's points about education. Although the budget tool has to close on a specific date for us to have time to collect the data, synthesize it, and understand it for Budget 2020, the information is going to reside on our websites there afterwards. So that way people can continue to inform themselves on the challenges with our budget and what things cost and what service levels are associated, etc. So we're not going to shut down the information, we're just going to shut down the actual application of the budget simulator itself.
Thank you, sir.
All right, again, thanks to staff. That's the only concern I had, is the window of opportunity is 3 weeks. It's pretty short. So I do know that staff is going to hit the ground running. They have targeted their audiences already. They've talked to some of our own staff, and they'll take a look at it. So we're all looking forward to what input we see here. So again, thanks to you, Kevin, your staff, Nancy Moore, thank you very kindly. We're just going to have a receive and file on that. It'll go to council on the 25th. So.
Moved and seconded, thank you kindly. All those in favor?
Aye.
And those opposed? Great. Motion to adjourn. Thank you, everyone.
He spoke to, yeah, he asked me last September, he planned the whole thing, all the music, all the selections, all the speakers, like, Wayne spoke, right, about, the first time we had him, 26 years old, and all this worry about putting on a hockey game, and it was sort of like, he called them mom, don't worry about it, I got it, and he crossed every T, dotted every I, music selection, where the flowers are, it was just unbelievable. It was really beautiful last night. The hockey ministries, Bruce Smith,
Yeah, Bruce, he's a guy.
Unbelievable, yeah, he was